York City. The skyline, the energy, the endless opportunity, but also some of the highest rent prices in the world. My name is Grace and welcome to Gracefully Smart, a channel about navigating adulthood one smart step at a time. I'm moving to New York City for work and I'm going to bring you along with me on my apartment hunting journey. I'll walk you through what you need to know before renting here, from budgeting and paperwork to touring 6 real apartments under $2,500. So if you're thinking about moving to New York City or just curious about what rent looks like, then this video is for you. Let's get right into it. First, let's talk about what you need to rent in New York City, starting with the budget. New York City is one of the most expensive cities in the world to rent. As of June 21st, 2025, the average rent for a studio apartment in New York City was $3,430, and the average rent for a one-bedroom was $3,910. So, if this is your first time hearing about New York City rent prices, the numbers in this video are going to seem really high, especially for what you get. Here's how I calculated my budget. I took my gross annual income and then subtracted taxes and my retirement contribution. This gave me my take-home pay per year, which I then divided by 12 to get my take-home pay per month. Then I used the 50-30-20 rule, which states that 50% of your take-home pay should go to needs, 30% should go to wants, and 20% should go to savings. Since we're looking for rent, I'm going to multiply my take-home pay per month by 50%, which gives me the amount of money I should spend in my needs category. After this, I just subtracted other needs, such as transportation. For me, this includes the subway, which is around $132 per month. Then I've subtracted monthly groceries and monthly utilities. Doing this gave me a rent budget of $2,169, and I decided to round this up to $2,300 to be able to afford a studio or one-bedroom apartment in a good location. In this case, I consider the extra $131 to come from my wants category, since living in a studio/one-bed rather than living with roommates is more of a want than a necessity. I did later have to increase this to $2,500 in order to be able to see more apartments, because there were just way too few units under $2,300, and the ones that were rented out really quickly. To qualify for an apartment, you need to pass the 40 times rent rule, which states that a tenant's gross annual income should be at least 40 times the monthly rent. For example, if you're looking at an apartment for $2,000, then you would need to make at least $80,000 per year. But if you don't pass the 40 times rent rule, you can still get an apartment with a guarantor who makes at least 80 times the monthly rent. The guarantor agrees to be financially responsible for the apartment if the tenant, for whatever reason, is unable to pay rent, and this gives added security to the landlord. For new hires or college graduates, a lot of the time the landlord will require a guarantor anyway, even if you do make 40 times the monthly rent. This is because new hires/college grads usually have a really short credit history, no proof of stable income yet, and no rental history. If you don't personally know someone who can be a guarantor for you, then you can get a third-party guarantor online, but this is a very expensive option because it can cost up to 1 month's rent. As for paperwork, it's really important that you prepare all of your paperwork beforehand, so you can submit your application as soon as you see an apartment that you like, because in New York City, the market is very competitive. Some landlords may require different or additional paperwork, but in general, you should prepare the following: an employment verification letter, including your job title, function, salary, and length of employment, 3 most recent pay stubs, 3 most recent bank statements, federal tax return, including your W-2 or 1099 form, and copies of 2 forms of ID. A tip here is to make sure you prepare all of your documents in a single PDF. This will make it much easier when you're submitting an application because you can just attach one file as opposed to each document separately. This will help you submit your application faster and get an edge over other applicants. A lot of apartments are given out on a first-come, first-served basis, so any advantage you have will help. Overall, here's what you need to have saved up in order to afford moving to New York City. You'll need first month's rent, a security deposit, which is usually equal to 1 month of rent, and a broker's fee. This is a fee that a lot of apartments require to pay for the listing agent's services. For broker's fee apartments, the tenant must pay it even if they didn't hire the broker themselves. And this can be up to 15% of annual rent, or 1 to 2 months of rent. But as of June 11th, 2025, which was in the middle of my search, the FAIR Act went into effect in New York City. This requires landlords and not renters to pay the broker's fee. In theory, this sounds really good, but most likely what will end up happening is that landlords will pass the costs down to the renters anyway by raising rent. And we'll talk about exactly how this impacted my search later in the video. Other costs to consider include the application fee. This should be no more than $20 per person, furniture costs, as well as other moving costs such as hiring a moving company. With my budget and documents ready, here's exactly what I was looking for in an apartment. Here are my must-haves. I wanted a studio or one bedroom. I really didn't want want to live with roommates because I really valued my own freedom and privacy to do what I wanted in my personal space. And I also wanted to select an apartment that was 100% based on my criteria rather than compromising with someone else. In terms of location, I was mainly interested in Manhattan or Brooklyn. I didn't have a specific preference for neighborhood. I just wanted it to be safe. I also wanted it to be close to the subway station, preferably under a 10-minute walk, a commute to work under 40 minutes, preferably with no transfers on the subway, walking distance to a grocery store, and a laundromat within 5 minutes. I don't mind going to a laundromat if it's right next to the building, because sometimes I find that even more convenient than in-building laundry that is poorly maintained or the machines are always taken by the other people in the building. New York City also has a lot of wash and fold services where you can pay the laundromat to do your laundry and deliver it for you, and this will still be significantly cheaper than if you were to pay for an apartment with in-unit laundry. For the size/layout, because of my budget, I was okay with having a smaller apartment. I really only needed to fit a bed, dresser, and desk in case I needed to work from home. I also wanted a full kitchen with counter space, or at least enough room for a table, because I want to cook as much as possible. Since I'm already paying a lot for rent, I might as well save on food. And I prefer the kitchen to be separated from the sleeping area, because I don't really want to sleep where I cook and have the entire apartment smell whenever I want to make something. In general, location was more important to me than size, unless the size, of course, was way too small to be justified by the price. Other things I wanted include no higher than the 4th floor walk-up. With my budget, I probably wasn't going to get an elevator building, and I did not prefer the 1st floor because I didn't want to have to deal with any pests or people on the street being able to see into my apartment. Some nice to haves include rent stabilized. This just means that the city limits how much the landlord can increase rent each year. Pet friendly, because I might want to get a cat. In-unit/in-building laundry, but this was pretty unlikely. And all utilities included, just to save some money every month. Once I knew what I was looking for, I started searching, and here's how I tried to find those apartments. The main platform that people use to post and look for apartments in New York City is StreetEasy, and you can search for apartments based on your specific criteria. Other sites include Zillow and Craigslist, but StreetEasy is the most popular. You should know the New York City rental market is extremely competitive, especially in the summer when a lot of people are moving to the city, such as new grads. Apartments get rented really fast. Some even get taken the same day that they're posted. So I decided to hire a broker that was recommended by my company. According to their website, you can make an appointment with them and see 5 to 10 apartments in one day and find your apartment on the first try. At the beginning of my search, I thought I might as well hire my own broker if it was highly likely I was going to have to pay a broker's fee anyway, even if I searched by myself. I also live far from the city, so it would be really inconvenient to constantly have to go to the city to do apartment tours. I really didn't want to have to travel to the city multiple times only to find out that they've already been rented out. This was also my first time renting in New York City, which again is very competitive, so I thought I could use the help to make sure I got a good apartment. I'll discuss later if I thought getting a broker was worth it or not. As for when to search, I'd recommend looking on StreetEasy 1 to 2 months before you move in to get an idea of what you can get for different prices in different neighborhoods. Then you can start doing apartment tours 3 to 4 weeks before. At first I thought this sounded pretty late, but then I realized that the inventory in New York City turns over really fast. For my July move-in, I scheduled an appointment with my broker in the first week of June. And honestly, I could have waited even longer because most of the apartments we saw that day were ready for immediate move-in, and we had to negotiate to push the move-in date as late as possible. Once I told my broker what we were looking for, he lined up a bunch of tours, and that's when the real search began. Let's get into the apartment tours. Originally, I also wanted to see apartments in Brooklyn, but my broker recommended staying in Manhattan because he said the Brooklyn apartments with a reasonable commute for me would actually be the same price or higher, and the more affordable Brooklyn apartments would be too far east. On the day of the appointment, our broker told us that they were seeing record low inventory for the month, which was great news for us. So as you'll see, not all of the apartments fit my criteria, which is pretty typical for apartment hunting in New York City. The first apartment we saw was in the East Village, and this was a 1-bedroom for $2,500. When we entered, there was a small living area right next to the kitchen. The kitchen and bathroom layouts were okay. There was some counter space and some storage. It's kind of hard to tell in the video, but both seem kind of dirty and not the most maintained. And this one was actually originally listed as a studio, but because the bedroom was separated, it was technically considered a 1-bedroom. But the main con of this apartment was that it was a first floor street view unit, so people can see directly into the apartment from the street. So if I were to live here, even though there are windows to let in natural light, I would have to keep the curtains closed at all times to avoid people looking in. And the other window in the living area was blocked by another building, so there was no natural light at all. There was also no closet space, and the listing agent was telling us that there was an additional $50 per month fee to pay for heat and hot water, which is pretty strange because it should be standard in New York City apartments that heat and hot water are included in the rent. So overall, this apartment seemed kind of sketchy, and so it was a no for me. The second apartment we saw was also in the East Village. This was a studio for $2,400. Unfortunately, I did not film there because the tenant was still living there, and when we got to the building, we actually met the tenant instead of the listing agent. This was also a first floor unit, but it was in the building behind the building facing the street, so it was still better than the first street view apartment. apartment. The main con, however, was that it was really small. I found these pictures on StreetEasy, but the apartment did not look like this in person. It was way smaller. Once you enter, you were facing the kitchen. There was the bathroom on the right side, and on the left side, there was probably enough room for maybe a twin bed, possibly a full, and then your bed would be directly next to the kitchen. There was no room for a desk, no room for a dresser. And also, this was still a first floor unit facing the courtyard, so the people walking into the building could still see into it. The tenant that was living there had shades up to prevent that from happening, so there was no natural light at all. Some pros were that the kitchen and bathroom seemed pretty nice. They seemed newer and well maintained, and the tenant said he didn't really have any problems with the apartment and didn't have any problems with pests from being on the first floor. But overall, especially for $2,400, I just could not get over the size. So this was also a no for me. So at this point during the tours, my standards were lowered by a lot. I thought this was just what I was gonna get for my budget, and I was even trying to convince myself that I would be okay living in the second apartment that we saw. But this finally changed when we saw the third apartment. This apartment was in the Upper East Side, and it was a studio for $2,300. When we got to the area, it was nice and busy with a lot of restaurants and shops. Originally, I thought the Upper East Side was going to be really expensive, but the studios were actually more affordable than the ones in the East Village. This was technically a first floor unit, but since there were no apartments on the ground floor, you still had to walk up a flight of stairs, so it was more like the second floor instead of street view. When we walked in, there was lots of natural light coming from two big windows. It was nice and spacious with high ceilings. There was one closet, and the listing agent told us that the previous tenant had lived there for 3 years, which is always a good sign when someone stays in an apartment for a long time. The con, however, was that the kitchen was really small. There was barely any counter space, and it only had a mini fridge with a very small freezer compartment. So I would probably have to buy a separate freezer. It was also on a main road, so it was really noisy, and the listing agent told us that they had multiple showings before us and sent out several applications but hadn't heard back from anyone yet. Overall, this was a great option, and I seriously considered applying for it. On our way to the fourth apartment, our broker advised us that if we liked the apartment before, we should cancel the rest of the tours and go apply for it immediately, especially since there were so many showings before us. But I decided to wait and see the fourth apartment just to have something to compare it to. And because I felt like my decision was time sensitive, at the same time I decided to skip the last tour and just pick between the third and fourth apartments. This was because I was already satisfied with the third apartment and I didn't want to risk losing it. The fourth apartment we saw was also on the Upper East Side, and it was a studio for $2,450. It was farther up on the Upper East Side, so the area was much quieter and more residential. This was also a first floor unit, but it was facing the back of the building. When we entered, it was narrower than the previous apartment, but it was still very spacious with high ceilings. The main thing that stood out to me though was that the kitchen was very nice. It was completely newly renovated with stainless steel appliances, and the refrigerator was completely new with tags on the inside. There was also a lot of cabinet storage, plus there was a dishwasher, which is pretty nice for a New York City apartment. The bathroom was nice and clean, and there was a lot of storage behind the mirrors, and it was only 1 block away from the subway. The cons, however, were that there was only one small window in the back to let in natural light. The other window was facing directly a building, and there were actually quite a few pigeons living in the gap between the buildings, with a bit of pigeon poop as well. In the moment, I overlooked the lack of natural light because the overhead lights were turned on, so I didn't notice it as much. I was so excited about the kitchen that I decided to apply for it immediately, and the listing agent told us that if I wanted it, it was mine. I thought that was it and that I had finally found my apartment. But that same day I went home and I just had a gut feeling that it wasn't right. What threw me off at first was that after the appointment, I decided to look up on StreetEasy the fifth apartment that we skipped, which I probably shouldn't have because I realized that it was pretty good and maybe even better than the apartment I chose at a lower price. So according to what I found on StreetEasy, this fifth apartment was a studio for $2,300. I saw that it was in a much better location with a lot of restaurants and shops nearby, but StreetEasy did say it was in contract the day after my appointment, so I probably wouldn't have gotten it anyway since our tour was late in the day. From there, all of the flaws of the apartment that I chose became much clearer. Before, I was just really excited because this one was much better than the previous apartments that we saw, but that ended up clouding my judgment. I realized that the location wasn't the best. It was near the subway, but there weren't any big supermarkets nearby. It was also in a very quiet location, and it didn't feel as busy as the third apartment we saw. It also had an awkward layout. My bed would have to be the closest to the door, and because the apartment was rather narrow, there would be barely any room at the foot of my bed. The stove was also in the middle of the apartment, and the closet was in an awkward location, so I think I would have a tough time trying to arrange my furniture. And again, there was minimal natural light. I realized that if I wanted to put an air conditioning unit in the front window, then the air coming in may be contaminated by the pigeon poop, and I didn't want to put an air conditioning unit in the other window because it was the only other one that was facing the outside. This was my final straw. I ended up getting approved for the appointment, but I decided to withdraw my application, and back to apartment hunting it was. We rescheduled another appointment with my broker a week and a half later, and 2 days before my appointment, the Fair Act went into effect. What ended up happening was that some landlords started raising their rent prices immediately, whereas a lot lot of others took their listings off the market while they were deciding what to do. Unfortunately for me, this meant that we were working with limited options, but our broker was still able to find some apartments for us to tour. We had a couple of apartments on the list, but one of them got rented at the beginning of our appointment. The other one was over a 20-minute walk to the subway, so I decided to cancel that one. But of the remaining options, I really liked the locations. They were nearby lots of stores and restaurants, and also well connected to the subway. On the day of our second appointment, the sixth apartment we saw on our search was on the Upper East Side, and it was a studio for $2,350. This was a 4th floor walk-up with no elevator. At first I thought this was going to be too high up, but after doing it, I realized there was only 3 flights of stairs and it wasn't that bad. When we entered, the first thing I noticed was that there was a lot of counter space. There was the kitchen, and then a countertop separating the kitchen from the living area. But from a closer look, I think it was the previous tenant that installed it because it didn't look like it was that professionally done. There was also a window in the kitchen, which is pretty nice because you can let the smells go out while you're cooking. But there was only a mini fridge, so I'd probably have to buy a separate freezer on my own. In the living space, there was a lot of natural light coming from 2 big windows. In general, it was more spacious than I expected. It wasn't the biggest, but it also wasn't too small. And there was a lot of storage. There were 2 closets with 2 additional storage closets on top. But what I didn't like was that part of the wall kind of juts into the living space, and so that ended up taking a lot of room. In the bathroom, it was small and a little dirty, not a lot of room for storage, and the electricity was turned off, so it was hard to see the details. But overall, I think it was still a really good option, and it was at a good price for the location. The next apartment we saw was also in the Upper East Side. This was a 1-bedroom for $2,500. It was the 3rd floor walk-up with no elevator. When we entered, there was 1 large window in the living area with an AC unit. The living area was decently spacious, but it was narrower than the studio we saw before. There was 1 large closet, and it had a separated kitchen with counter space. There was window in the kitchen, which is always nice, but similar to the last apartment we saw, there was only a mini fridge. On the left side, there was the bedroom. It was pretty dark and small. The window was right next to another building, so there was no natural light, but I could still fit a bed and a dresser. Also, the electricity was off, so it was kind of hard to tell what the bedroom would look like if I lived there. There was also another large closet in the bedroom, and then there was the bathroom. This was really similar to the previous unit we saw. Small, not a lot of storage, but still usable, and it was cleaner than the previous one we saw. In general, I liked how each part of the apartment was separated, but it did have less natural light than the previous studio, and each room felt more closed off. Still, I was considering applying for it because it met my criteria, and I thought $2,500 was pretty good for a 1-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side. After touring all the apartments, I had to weigh the pros and the cons and make a decision. So what did I end up picking? I found an apartment that felt just right. It was under my budget, in a neighborhood I really liked, with a layout that works for me. I'm gonna keep the details private for now, but subscribe to stay tuned for an apartment tour in the future. After going through the process from start to finish, here's what I think about using a broker. In my specific case, I think it was worth it. There was a big chance I needed to pay a broker's fee anyway when I was searching before the FAIR Act, and hiring a broker removed a lot of stress because we could act fast in a competitive environment. Brokers have connections with other brokers to schedule appointments, and they do the paperwork for you and send in the application as fast as possible. But do note, not all brokers are created equal, so do your research and make sure your broker is reliable. I knew mine was because it was recommended by my company. Also, since we lived far from the city, we didn't have to worry about constantly traveling to the city over a course of a month to see apartments. We could just do it in a day or 2. As a first-time renter, the process is really confusing and fast-moving, so it's really helpful to have someone walk us through it. But of course, hiring a broker is very expensive. If you're willing to put in the time and effort, then hiring a broker is not necessary at all. Would I use a broker again? Probably not. Now that I live in the city, it'll be much easier to schedule and do apartment tours if I decide to move. I also understand the process way better now after doing it once, and after the FAIR Act, I won't have to pay a broker's fee anymore. Now, rent will probably go up, but I can always filter for apartments under my budget. In general, people that should consider hiring a broker include first-time renters who live out of state / far from the city, looking to minimize stress and are able to afford the fee, and who doesn't need a broker include people who have convenient access to the city, have experience renting, and are looking to reduce living costs. Now that I've been through it all, here are a few key takeaways I'd give for someone starting their apartment hunt in New York City. The first thing I'd say is to be ready with your paperwork. New York City apartments go really fast, especially if it's a good one. Collect all the necessary paperwork beforehand, so once you see an apartment you like, you can go and apply for it right away. This will give you an edge over other applicants who still need to find their documents. Next, know your budget. Make sure that you can qualify for the apartments that you want by passing the 40 times rent rule or having a guarantor who makes 80 times the rent. And make sure to always tour the apartment. Pictures on StreetEasy can be deceiving. It's really hard to tell the size of an apartment from a picture, especially if the pictures are photoshopped or extremely zoomed out. You also don't know what the surrounding location is going to look like until you go and visit in person. Another tip is to be decisive. Do as much research as you can on the apartments before touring them in person. So once you go to the tour, you can focus on the unit itself and its surrounding area. And make sure you've seen enough units to make comparisons. Don't be like me and make a decision too soon. But if you do find an apartment that you really like and have done enough research, then go ahead and apply right away before someone else takes it. And lastly, be ready to compromise. If you're on a budget, it's likely that you'll probably have to let go of one or two must-haves. Don't be afraid of laundromats. They're everywhere in the city, and you can also pay for a wash and fold service. And this can save you a few $100s of rent each month without in-unit laundry. And know which criteria are more important to you than others. For example, if you value location more than size, or vice versa. And if you're just starting your search, I hope this gives you a solid head start. That wraps up my New York City apartment hunting journey. I hope this helped you get a clearer idea of what to expect when renting in New York City, or at least made the process feel a little less intimidating. If you've been through the apartment hunt here, or are just starting, please leave a comment below and share your experience, or ask any questions you may have. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more smart living tips. I'll be sharing more about settling into my new space and navigating post-grad life in the city. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.